Our subject this morning is confidence, certainty, and cheer. When Paul the Apostle crossed over into Europe and came to the city of Philippi to begin the ministry in Europe, he received very bad treatment. The entire city seems to have turned against him, and he was arrested and actually seems to have been tried by the citizens of the town and was delivered to the hands of a jailer and put into the very darkest part of the dungeon, having been beaten in an inch of his life. The treatment that Paul received at the hands of the people of Philippi may give the impression that there could be no strong ties of friendship of Paul with the people there. But the facts are that the church in Philippi came closer to the Apostle Paul than any of the others. He enjoyed a more intimate relationship with them with any other visible church that he established. There were strong ties of love and fellowship. It's beautiful to behold, and it's worthy of emulation. They loved him, and he loved them. Paul came to Philippi here on this second missionary journey, and it was the proper place to begin in Europe, because the city of Philippi had been named for King Philip of Macedonia. It was primarily a Greek city. Then the great Augustus of Rome made it a Roman colony. And you'll find in this epistle Paul saying several things that are not understood unless you recognize that this was a Roman colony and what it meant to be a Roman colony. Therefore, in the city of Philippi, there were Romans, there were Greeks, there were Jews, there were Asiatics. It was a cosmopolitan colony, and it was a good place to test the gospel in Europe. And when Paul came to this city, Lydia was his first convert, apparently a very remarkable woman. And then the Philippian jailer, a Roman politician, brutal and cruel, but one who came to know the living Christ. Now, in the city of Philippi, you would note that it was a higher type of person who came into the church. There were so many slaves that were brought in other places, but here they seemed to have enjoyed a freedom they did not know elsewhere. The upper strata of society was reached, a better class, we'd say today, and apparently many were won from all these different races that were there. And this church maintained this close relationship with Paul from the very first. But they did lose track of him. When Paul was arrested in Jerusalem and taken down to Caesarea, spent 2 years there, during that period they lost track of him. And then they heard when he was transferred to Rome that he was in prison. And they were distressed, and they sent their pastor Epaphroditus with a gift for the Apostle Paul. They also sent a word of comfort and sympathy to him, expressing their love and affection to him. And then Paul wrote a thank you note. That's the epistle to the Philippians that we have today. And in this epistle, there's no doctrine to declare, there's no error to correct, there's no conduct to rebuke, there's no problem to solve, there's no difficulty to handle. He just talks about Christian living. It's Christian living at the highest and at the best. And Paul, I think, when Epaphroditus arrived with the gift and the letter from the Philippian church, Paul asked him, how are things getting along over in Philippi among the believers? And I think he probably asked about each individual, for he seems to have known many of them by name. And then Epaphroditus said, you know, things are coming nicely there, God's blessing. But we just have one little problem. It's not a major problem. 2 women in the church weren't speaking to each other. That was not a major problem, but it was there. Two women, Euodias was the name of one, and Syntyche was the name of the other. They just weren't talking, and Paul mentioned it when he got to the 4th chapter. I beseech Euodias and beseech Syntyche that they be of the same mind. I've often wondered what the background was. I've always felt that probably that Euodias was president of the Missionary Society. And I have felt that probably Syntyche was president of the choir. You know, I have a friend in the ministry, and he says that when the devil was cast out of heaven, he fell in the choir loft. But that's not true at the Church of the Open Door. It wasn't here, was it, Ted? It was some other choir loft he fell in. But anyway, what happened was Ms. Euodias and Mrs. Syntyche had arranged to get the church parlor on Tuesday afternoon at 2 o'clock, and there was a conflict, and both groups arrived at the same time. And they didn't, one wasn't willing to give way to the other, and it did cause a problem for just a little while. I think it got straightened out all right, but they weren't speaking to each other. They were rather cool to each other. The old Scotch elder got up to read the 4th chapter of Philippians. He was not what you would call a trained man, and his pronunciation was rather bad. He got to this verse. He says, I beseech Odious and Syntyche that they be of the same mind. And though his pronunciation is bad, his interpretation was unusually good. Because, frankly, when you bring together Ms. Odious and Ms. Syntyche, you're going to have trouble. I don't care who they are. And so apparently that's what happened in the church in Philippi. But Paul mentioned that. But he also mentions with the warm words his personal relationship and feeling and his close tie. I want you to notice that in this epistle, just to introduce it to us this morning, he says, grace be unto you and peace from God our Father, from the Lord Jesus Christ. Now that's his custom introduction. You'll find it in all of his epistles. Grace comes first. Peace always follows. One is the cause and the other is the effect, always. Grace was the great word of the Roman world. It's a Greek word. Charis was a word of introduction, of greeting in the Roman world. You could have heard it all over the ancient Roman world. Two men would meet, they'd say charis. They are greeting each other. Grace. And then the Hebrew word of greeting was shalom, peace. Paul brought these two words together, and someone has said he Christianized them. I don't like that, but I do think this. He gave them a meaning, and they'll never be the same again. Grace speaks of that declaration of God's love for us. And the result of the reception of the love of God is to know the peace of God. Grace always comes first. Then Paul goes on and says, I thank my God upon every remembrance of you. And actually, what he's saying is something even stronger. I thank my God for all the remembrance of you. This is something that is wonderful. Every now and then, some kind brother will put this in a letter, and you always feel like today that it's stereotyped, that it's, it's the thing to do, and you like to say it. But when Paul said it the first time, he meant it. Isn't it wonderful to be a people like these people were? Paul says anytime, anywhere in the Roman Empire, anybody mentions Philippi, I do not think of that jail. I think of the church that is there. And I think of those believers that are there. And I thank God for them. I thank God for all remembrance of you. What a wonderful thing that is. He's not through. He says always in every prayer. and it should be every petition, for it's very direct here. Always in every prayer of mine for you all, making request or making supplication or petition for you. These people were on the prayer list of the Apostle Paul, and he said something else here. I must call attention to this. Even as it is meet or right for me to think this of you all, because I have you in my heart. Isn't that lovely? Paul says, I carry the church in Philippi in my heart. I saw the other day in a watch of a man, his wife, she's dead now, but he carries it in his watch. He carries her there. That's a wonderful place.